Today's guest is John Danner, co-founder and CEO of Flourish Schools, an innovative middle school network that launched earlier this year in Nashville, Tennessee. John has a long career as a pioneer and thought leader in education innovation, including building several successful ed tech companies. Before that, back in 2007, John co-founded and was CEO of Rocket Ship Public Schools, the first blended elementary school network in the country. Today, Rocket Ship operates 25 schools in 5 states, serving 12,000 students a year, with many of its schools ranking at the academic top in their states, despite serving an average of 84% free and reduced meal students. Before Rocket Ship, John was a public school teacher in the Nashville public schools. He holds a BS and an MS in electrical engineering from Stanford and a master's in education from Vanderbilt. John Danner, welcome to the Liberated Podcast.
Thank you, Kerry. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's so great to have you here. I really want to spend some time talking about your latest startup, Flourish Schools, and all the excitement around that. But would love to hear a little bit more of your backstory, including kind of the early days as a public school teacher.
Yeah. Um, what I would say is that I started in tech. I was a double E, as you said, and started a company, Net Gravity, that was one of the first internet companies. Took it public, sold it, and just had the fortune to get to decide what I wanted to do with the rest of my life at age 32. And really, just by sheer luck and coincidence, one of my friends was starting a middle school in San Jose. He's a Jesuit, Peter Pabst, and he's starting this Sacred Heart Nativity School. I got involved in that. It was incredible. And I was like, wow, this seems like a way better mission than what I was doing at Net Gravity, which is serving ads to people on the internet, right? It wasn't really a close contest in terms of like what seemed more meaningful in life. So I went off and became a teacher, moved to Nashville, attended Vanderbilt, taught school, middle school and elementary school for 3 years. It was a far harder job. We had taken Net Gravity public, so I was a public company CEO. Teaching was a far more difficult job, both physically and emotionally. Kind of just the intensity was really off the charts, I would say, but just so rewarding. It was obvious that, this was a great thing to do with my life. But as an entrepreneur, I'm not very satisfied with the way things work. So at the same time, really wanted to change kind of the nature of school and classroom. And so I spent those 3 years kind of bugging the CAO for our school district in Nashville to do things differently, to kind of use data more effectively to track how students were reading, for example. Kind of ultimately, I think if I hadn't left the school district, I probably would have been fired. I'm not sure, but like it's pretty close. Like my principal had to have many heart-to-heart conversations with me about why kind of education didn't work the way I thought it did. And so then I went off and started Rocket Ship. And Rocket Ship was more or less just the embodiment of my own classroom, kind of the idea that every child is different and that the way you should teach is not to think this child's 8 years old. Here are the things they need to know, but to think about who is this child, what do they know, what's going to be most helpful to them, and then build your curriculum based on all the kids you have in your class and how you can work with them one-on-one and in small groups. So kind of, really the opposite, I think, of the way school was working at the time. So we did that I was there for 8 years. It's been around for 16 at this point. It was great. But, the charter school world is difficult. I found by the end of that, it was a little much. Politically, mostly. I mean, the kids were great, the teachers were great, but that relationship you had to have with school districts, which was super contentious, just wasn't fun at all. So I was very happy to leave after a few years.
And then you went into ed tech.
Yeah.
So kind of combining
Yeah.
your experience in tech entrepreneurship now with your newfound passion for education. What was that leap like for you?
Yeah, I mean, my theory with EdTech, Rocket Ship was very EdTech focused, and we had a lot of tools we were using in our learning lab for individualized learning. My theory was that the technology really needed to be a lot better in this space, and that
Mm.
kind of devoting time and energy to that would be good. I think my lessons learned from EdTech are mostly that, the process of getting basically schools, especially public schools, treat technology very differently than a lot of other parts of society. If you're talking about companies and corporations, they often are using technology to compete and create an advantage and that kind of thing. You certainly see it a lot with AI right now, but schools don't really think that way. Schools are kind of an aggregation of teachers in a way, and so they kind of feel the way the teachers feel. And, teachers feel like technology is not always their friend. So, and it's unclear how it's useful sometimes. So, just the process of um, selling technology to schools is a lot more difficult, really than I thought it would be. And even like, one of my recent companies, Project Read, which does reading instruction for science of reading. Um, I think it's a pretty great product. It took a couple years for people to kind of realize that using AI for this kind of thing was actually a pretty big positive for teachers and students. So, ed tech is its own little ball of fun. Luckily with what I'm doing today, I'm a user of ed tech again, which I think is a more comfortable place to be.
Yeah, so let's talk about that and about Flourish Schools
Yeah.
because now you're back creating classrooms
Yeah.
and this network of middle schools. Where did this idea come from and what is it about?
I mean, when I left Rocket Ship, I pretty much vowed I'd never do a school network again.
Hmm.
It was just a really difficult, like it's super clear when you're a software person how much more complicated schools are. They're probably 100 times more complicated in terms of the number of people, the number of things that are going on. They're just very complex things. So, I really didn't want to do anything more in schools when I left Rocket Ship. And I'd say for, 5 years, I was just decompressing from the rocket ship experience. But, probably the last 5 years or so, I've been thinking, about how do we create a larger change in kind of the way schools work. I mean, I would say that AI in general, many people think that AI is a pretty profound change in the way their work is or their personal lives or whatever. But, schools really haven't adjusted much at all. And so I think it was really through my experience with Project Read and Sparkspace, one of the other companies that I created that does writing, to just realize if you want to make a change in the way classrooms work and kids are educated, you at least for me, I felt like I kind of had to take more ownership of that and not just like bemoan the fact that people weren't using the tools that I was building well. So Flourish is really like, okay, let's figure out like how is a classroom going to be different over the next 5 or 10 years.
So, how is it going to be different, John? I guess tell us a little bit more about the Flourish model, and then in particular, why a middle school model?
I mean, Kerry, I love that you wrote the book Joyful Learning because I think that joy is really what's been kind of squeezed out of school over the last 20, 25 years, as we went down this kind of, in my mind, it was kind of No Child Left Behind kind of set us up for this very data-driven kind of knowledge cramming testing type world, of which really Rocket Ship was a really good example. We did that stuff well. We were very efficient at that game. And Flourish is really the opposite. Why, kind of stepping back, why do we go to school? What's the purpose of school? And what would we like it to feel like for kids in the modern age? So a few
Mm.
things I think have changed. With AI, arguably like it seems unlikely that the number of things a child knows is going to be a big differentiator for them in life. Really, almost everything that you need to know is free and at the tip of your fingers at this point. So, being a better knower of things doesn't seem like a skill that's important. But what seems important is, all of these things that in education we've kind of I wouldn't say denigrated, but like we just haven't paid attention to all the skills, mindsets, habits, the the ethics of being a human. And I think all those things are going to be more important for kids growing up now than they ever have been. So, what's your sense of agency, curiosity, persistence, leadership, communication, all these things that were kind of just afterthoughts of kind of the last 20 years of education. I think that's the point now, for me at least. And I think the beauty of that is that those are very human things. So when you talk about, joy in the classroom, it's much easier to create joy when you're emphasizing those things than when you're emphasizing, whatever mixed fractions or something like that. So, really the idea with Flourish is to instead of telling kids what to do when they show up in the morning, say, well, what would you like to do? And then helping them figure out how to do that, often with other groups of students. You asked about middle school.
Mm,
One of the reasons that I think middle school is such a great opportunity is by and large, when kids go to elementary school, it's about socialization. You've got a few things to learn, but it's a pretty good time for a lot of kids. Maybe by fourth or fifth grade, it starts to be a little bit more difficult, but a lot of kids are just like, they don't even know what school is, so it works fine. But by middle school, a lot of kids are starting to hate school. It's
mm.
like, I'm not sure why I need to be in school anymore. This isn't fun, et cetera. And so creating classrooms that are actually really fun and joyful I think is the opportunity. And I think that kids can really learn a ton when they're motivated and in a classroom that they look forward to going to every day.
And it sounds like you're really trying to get the best of both worlds for these talented teachers and leveraging the latest technologies. I wonder if you can talk about how you do
Yeah.
that.
I mean, I think there are a few things that have changed in the mechanics of the classroom that really you don't see people doing yet. One that has started to happen is just that the foundational knowledge you need, kind of basic reading, writing, and math skills, there's just no reason for teachers to teach it anymore. And so we call ours foundations. We do that all with AI. It's easy. It's really of all the things we're doing, the easiest thing to do because when you use ed tech tools and kind of overlay with an AI coach, which is what we do,
Hmm.
um, most kids are motivated to learn those things, and they're not very complicated as long as you don't kind of keep going. I mean, I think the main thing with knowledge is you're trying to figure out what does a child need to know such that they can access all of the knowledge that's out there. You're not trying to say, well, how can I preload as much knowledge into each child's brain so that they can recall it, kind of automatically all the time? That's not actually nearly as important as it used to be. So we try to keep it very simple in what like they're learning, but moving that from the teacher's plate into a world where they're using AI to learn it. That's I think that's very controversial in this space, but it's not at all technically difficult.
Hmm.
It's basically a solved or very solvable problem. So that's one piece. It's just like teachers should not be teaching these kind of rote things anymore. There's no point in doing that. And
Hmm.
that was a huge amount of, I taught second grade. That was a huge amount of my planning time was just like, okay, well, what's the fundamentals of reading and where are all my kids and what do I need to be doing? And so just automating that so I'm not thinking about that, I think is very helpful. Um, the thing that we're excited about is if you're going to emphasize these things we call superpowers, the skills, mindsets, habits, etc. If you're going to emphasize these superpowers, the problem with anything that was skill based in education is because it wasn't very measurable. Educators would say, "Oh yeah, that's really really important. A kid's curiosity is super important. I don't know how to measure it, so I don't know how to teach it, and I don't really know like why it's important." And so, kind of traditional educators would say, this is not something I can focus on. It's just a byproduct of whatever else I'm doing. And now we can measure it. So, at Flourish, students are wearing microphones. We transcribe their speech all day long. So we basically have a full record of what each student is saying in their groups and talking about, oh, we're experiential. So we're project based. Kids are working together on a lot of things. They're choosing their projects they want to do together. But we have these transcripts of everything they're
Mm,
saying. And using the transcripts, we can basically make assessments of all of these different skills that we think are valuable and measure them pretty precisely. The AI is actually it's a good rater at the start, and then once you give it more examples of ratings that the teachers have made, it
mm,
gets really superhuman. So now we live in a world where all of these previously unmeasurable things are very measurable. Like, okay, this child is a 2 out of 5 on curiosity. How do we move them up a level? Like what would be ways for them to do that? And that's where we want teachers spending time, and we want to augment the teacher's time with additional AI. When you watch students doing these projects, there's so many opportunities for little nudges on these skills. It's like a student will say, "Gosh, I just don't know how to do that." And if a teacher was standing right there, you know what the teacher would say, which is, well, Johnny, like, what do you think you could do to figure out how to take the next step, right? But the teacher is not there because they're a bunch of kids in the room. But AI can do that. So, our students have earpieces, and the AI can basically say, "Hey, Johnny, what are some ways that you could find out more about this so you could figure out your next step?" And that little nudge is often enough for the student to do it that time. And then the next time they're in a project and they're kind of stumped, they're just more likely to try that, right? And then the beauty of schools is you have so many reps on things that after a while they're like, oh yeah, I'm stumped, so I'm gonna go ask Gemini, or I'm gonna go ask OpenAI, or whatever, and then they get good at that thing. So I think our thesis is these superpowers are important. We believe we can measure them pretty well, and we believe we can help the teacher in moving kids in that direction. And the point of, that really is, I think it's better for the children, but I also think for a teacher, now you're kind of a CEO of a classroom or a leader of the classroom. You're
mm,
not kind of you don't do nitty gritty all day long. Like when I was teaching, it was probably 80% of the time was, I always give this example. If your group is doing readers theater, so you're kind of acting out a play, you've got a script and kids are reading their lines. Like in middle school, you basically could spend all day long just saying, speak up or speak slowly, right? Like, and that's what teachers do. They kind
mm,
of interject and say, hey, Johnny, you need to speak more loudly or whatever. Well, when you have a coach in a student's ear that just says every time, Johnny, you're not speaking loudly enough, or why don't you try to bring it up a level? Like over time, that works, and the teacher doesn't have to do that anymore. And so now they can like actually connect with the kids and spend their time like stretching their thinking, focusing on kind of higher order skills and kind of a little bit more the metacognition of like, well, why did we do that project and what was important about it? The things that make teachers um, important parts of kids' lives. And I would say, for at least my experience, is that most teachers, that's why they decide to become teachers.
right.
Right? They didn't decide to become teachers to do all the nitty gritty stuff.
Yeah. Ah, I love it. So I want to talk a little bit about structure, John, because you just launched this year. You have a handful of students. This is the first full academic year with your middle schoolers. Tennessee, you're in Nashville, Tennessee, the kind of inaugural location.
Yep.
Tennessee is one of the more difficult states in the country to launch private school, particularly a secular private school. All kinds of different categories depending on the
Yep.
type of school you are. There's sort of a booming homeschool, microschool movement there that tries to sort of get around some of these laws because they can be tricky. I'm wondering how you decided to structure Flourish and how does that fit in with kind of state regulations?
So we're micro schools, so we have a handful of kids now, but probably we'll never have a school of over 100 students. Kind of four classrooms or so. And we are private, and we very much want to figure out how to build kind of mixed income schools in states which have education savings account
Yeah,
laws. Um, I think there are two opportunities really. I think for kind of working class parents, the real thing is, well, you've always sent your kid to public school. That was kind of the option. But what if private school was extremely affordable? So for working
right.
class parents, we might be $100 or $200 a year. Not much. Enough that, they've got skin in the game, they're excited about it, but not, ruinously expensive. Um, what would it mean to send your child to a private school, and would that be a good experience? And then for kind of middle class parents, often middle class parents that were not able to send their kids to kind of the elite private schools, what would it mean to spend a couple $1,000s to send your child to this private school, kind of like the old Catholic schools were, they weren't so expensive. This was back in my day. I mean, I know they've all gotten expensive now, but they used to be a couple $1,000. And I think parents who were motivated enough on education figured out how to make that work. And I think they offered a pretty great education for the cost. So, that's where we'd like to live. And we're still figuring that out. We don't know how to kind of connect with either group very well yet. So that's one
Hmm.
of our big jobs to be done.
Yeah, I mean, of course, Tennessee earlier this year joined the growing ranks of states, passing universal eligibility school choice, applying to all K to 12 students. That really makes some of these innovative learning models more accessible to more families. So, I guess what is the sort of future plan? I know you're building the plane as you're flying it, but
Yeah.
what would be your goal with Flourish, say over the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, I mean, we'd like to start quite a few schools. My experience with Rocket Ship was basically you need a couple years where all you're doing is trying to figure out what your program is, how it works, how to do it, and that feels extremely painstaking and slow in many ways, but it's just necessary because these are kind of big human endeavors. So you have to
Mm,
figure out like what's the school look like, what's the culture, how's it feel, all of that. So probably for a couple of years it'll seem like we're doing nothing, but a lot of, it's like a duck,
research,
a lot of stuff's going on
R&D.
under the
Yeah,
water.
yeah, right.
Um, and then we'd like to start more schools. So Nashville was just extremely fortunate as a place to start. My co-founder, Adam Nadeau, is from Nashville, which is why we're there.
Hmm.
Um, and so, that was the obvious place to start. But the reason we're very fortunate, you're right, the ESA law and kind of the way the state deals with private schools is challenging. But through sheer luck, I would say, when they went through the charter school movement, they revised their real estate laws such that it was possible to create alternative schools. So most states have these laws that say that schools must be on 3 to 5 acres of land and all kinds of crazy old stuff that seems very historic. But those are still the laws on the books. So when you go to the city and you say, "Hi, I'd like to put this school in an office park or something like that," they just say, "No, you can't do that." Whereas kind of Nashville took the step to like redefine things such that if you're building a school, you can do that. And we certainly don't see Nashville is, or Tennessee is kind of the only place we can operate. We've been looking a lot at kind of other state laws. I was just at a conference, the Harvard New School Models conference, and one of the Utah representatives was at the conference. And I went up to her after her panel and I said, "Well, thank you. When you passed your law, you also passed this definition of micro schools as different than other schools. So they're kind of not subject to all of those old school regs and they have certain rights for building facilities, et cetera." That's huge. And basically all states need to do that. So we'll kind of, I think, end up building out in states which have figured those things out and then advocating with other states to kind of make it a good place to build micro schools.
And are you optimistic about this larger movement, John? I too was at the Emerging School Model Conference
Yeah.
at the Harvard Kennedy School. Their fourth annual keeps growing every year. So that's a sign of growing momentum. Are you optimistic that these new schools and spaces will continue to grow and gain traction?
Um, I think so. I think mostly because the demand is so significant. I just think that parents and students really are over it now when it comes to kind of traditional classroom-based learning. And so now it's kind of this time, which is a little bit awkward for people who are building networks and parents to like connect so that there's enough trust that they're willing to try these new things. But my experience is that by middle school, I really, I did rocket ship was elementary schools. I would say elementary schools are more joyful places in general. By middle school, a lot of kids are really, really miserable, and a lot of
Mm.
parents are really, really worried about bullying and other things. And I think micro schools really solve that problem well. I know also many, many homeschoolers, and as a homeschooler, elementary is a pretty straightforward thing to do. I mean, still homeschooling is basically like you're a superhuman to be able to do it, but at least kind of academically, it's manageable. As you move into middle and you get into algebra and other things, like, I think that it becomes valuable academically. I also think it becomes very valuable socially. That's really the time when kids are defining how they are relative to kind of everyone else. And so it's a great time to be in a small school environment. So I think there's a lot of momentum for people to be looking for alternatives right now. I think, frankly, the government is behind on this. They haven't really put the laws in place that allow for it. You see in states like Tennessee, there's still these like very onerous caps on how many people can participate. I think with Tennessee's new kind of universal law, there were 20,000 spots, and the first day 40,000 families
Right.
applied. I mean, it's just nowhere near what's necessary. But I guess, when you look at Florida or Arizona, it seems likely that if parents really, really want this, it will not be a smart thing to stand in the way of as a politician. So I think that's going to carry us through. Always dicey in education. I mean, we could talk for hours about all the terrible things that can go wrong, but it does seem like the momentum's in the right direction right now.
Yeah, I agree that I think that the momentum is building. I am slightly concerned, and so one of these sort of dicey topics is that as demand grows, as more and more of these school models emerge, that there will be calls for greater regulation, standardization, and we saw this in the charter movement, and you were part of that. How
Totally.
do we prevent charter schools 2.0 in this emerging micro
Yeah.
school space?
Yeah, I think that is a very good key concern. What I would say about charters in general is that I wasn't there when the idea was invented and the first laws passed, but it was really inherently a compromise between the public school system and these kind of more entrepreneurial private schools to marry that together. And it was kind of just a bad compromise. And one way as an operator that it was a bad compromise is that your school district was approving what you were doing. And so inevitably, charters at scale look more and more like the districts that authorize them, right? And so it's kind of hard to tell them apart at this point. And so what we definitely don't want to have happen with the micro school movement is that same like kind of conformity.
Right.
And I think you're right. I think that figuring out the way that public dollars get spent such that you know, bad operators, bad actors get kind of drummed out of business in some way, but that you don't create all of these um, assessment structures and things like that that schools have to conform to and kind of uh, if it's off mission for them, pretend that it is on mission. That was the big problem in the charter movement. So uh, at the Harvard conference we were just at, what one of the things I think that was good was many people said, look, like we should trust parents. Um, Parents are pretty good consumers of this stuff. You have to tell a parent why it is they should be at your school, how the child is learning. Every day the child comes home and like they have a conversation, like how'd that go? So they're certainly going to be very good on, is this a place that my child is experiencing joy and having fun? Is this a place that my child is safe? And then they're going to have frankly, as good a take on, are you doing a good job at preparing my child for, the rest of their life as any standardized test is. And so let's just leave it to the parents. I think that's the pure form here, is to not try to overregulate like what good is in this space.
Yeah. And what about traditional schools? You had said when you were a school teacher that if you hadn't quit, you would have likely been fired for trying to sort of make
Yeah.
some change within. Do you think that change can happen within traditional classrooms, or is it all outside?
I do. Flourish is actually a public benefit corporation, which is a somewhat technical thing, but means that in our bylaws for our company, the mission is actually in the bylaws. So if an investor says, "Well, that's nice, you were going to do this, but let's like make as much money as we can," we've got the legal ability to say, "No, actually, our job is to promulgate joyful classrooms through the use of AI and technology." So part of that obviously is just starting a lot of schools and making it awesome for a lot of kids and parents, but part of it is trying to influence how public schools, charter schools, everybody else does it. I am optimistic that they will adapt. I don't think it'll be quickly, which is one reason why I could have just started an ed tech company to try to do all these things and sell them to schools, and I think it would have flopped because that's not where they are yet. They're most teachers. I was just talking to two teachers at the high school I went to, and most teachers are back on like, AI is letting my kids cheat. What should I do about it? And so we need to move from that to like, here's this new capability all kids have. So what are you going to change in the way that you're teaching and assessing so that, it fits with the new technology, right? So it's going to take a while, but we would like to push more or less all of the things we're doing out into some sort of a foundation or a place where people can both use the code and get trained and stuff like that. So I do think they will get there. I think my hope is that private schools will have a better relationship with school districts than charter schools. I was talking to some school board members about this. Like the horrible thing about charter schools was that every, whatever couple of years, you'd have to be in this like public forum debating, the school district on like why you should survive and why you were doing better or whatever. And it was just so contentious and horrible. Like, like if I was on the district side, the last thing I would want to do is do anything that those guys are doing because they're the competition, the enemy. Whereas I think
Mm,
private schools are kind of just going down a different lane.
right.
And so I do think that we're going to be in a better position to say, hey, here's the things that we've learned, and we're sharing them freely, and we're happy to talk to you about them. So I hope that does happen. I haven't given up. I know a lot of
Yes,
people have.
I'm optimistic too. And I do think some of that kind of competitive pressure from education entrepreneurs like you is prompting public schools, especially in states that have robust choice programs, to start to compete to attract and retain families, which is exciting. So, as we begin to wrap up, John, most of my listeners and viewers are current or future school founders, often micro schools or hybrid schools or learning pods or homeschooling collaboratives. As a longtime entrepreneur, especially an education entrepreneur, what advice do you have for someone just starting on this path who wants to open a new school or space in the coming months?
Yeah. Um, I mean, I'll say something that won't be popular, but I try to tell founders the truth as often as possible. And I think there are lots of examples. I think Acton figured this out early. A lot of people have figured this out. It is difficult as an educator without a lot of business training to do these things properly because there's so many mechanics to building schools and collecting revenue and marketing and all that stuff that it it would be my main advice would be if you are a great educator and you want to start a school, find someone that you can work with. They don't have to be full time, but whatever time they'll give you that can really help you get things set up correctly. Because I find it terribly sad if somebody has this great classroom and it's joyful and it's all the things, but there's some other part of the mechanics they're not getting right, and that causes the school to fail. So I think increase your chances by having some expertise on the business side, I think is my main advice.
Great, great advice. Yeah, lots of these education entrepreneurs go into becoming a school founder because they want to get back to that love of teaching, but they don't necessarily know about accounting and
Yeah.
running a small business. And so partnering with folks that can help with that can ensure better success.
Yeah.
So, speaking of success, we're excited to kind of watch Flourish's success over time. If my listeners and viewers want to learn more about Flourish, follow your journey, what is the best way for them to do that?
Um, flourishschools.com is the website. I'm also very active on both LinkedIn and X, so you can follow along and throw comments and barbs at me and things like that. But that I would say X, LinkedIn, and our website are the best way.
Well, I am really looking forward to seeing the future of Flourish schools and this larger micro school movement. John Danner, thank you so much for being on the Liberated podcast.
Thank you, Kerry. Thanks for having me.